All right, let's get right into it. We're talking about a part of our financial system that's not just big, it's huge. And it's growing at an incredible speed. The thing is, it's starting to make some very important people, well, let's just say they're getting pretty nervous.
And look, when I say nervous, I'm not kidding. In late 2025, you had the world's top financial watchdogs, I'm talking about people like the Governor of the Bank of England, suddenly start putting out these really serious warnings. They started saying, hey, this feels a little, familiar, kind of like the stuff we saw just before the 2008 crash. So what's got them so worried? Well, it comes down to this number, $16 trillion. That's the best guess for how big this thing is, the global private credit market. And what is that? It's basically a whole industry that lends money to companies. But, and this is the key part, it operates mostly in the shadows, away from the usual rules that banks have to follow.
So you can see where this is going, right? It all boils down to this one really important question that we have to tackle. Is this enormous, kind of murky market a ticking time bomb for the global economy? Is Wall Street's shadow bank about to drag us into another crisis?
Okay, so to get a handle on what's going on, we've got to go back in time, because this whole thing didn't just pop up overnight. Nope, the seeds for it were planted way back in the chaos that followed the 2008 financial crisis. So after the 2008 meltdown, regulators came in and, laid down the law. You had things like the Dodd-Frank Act, which basically told banks you need to be safer, you need to hold more cash. And that worked kind of, but it had a side effect. Banks got way more cautious and they pulled back from lending to a lot of companies. And what happens when they pull back? It creates a huge gap, a power vacuum really, and something was bound to step in and fill it.
Now, you might think of these private credit funds and the big banks as competitors, right? Battling it out for business. But that's not really the full picture. It's actually more like they're partners in a dance. They are totally, completely connected behind the scenes.
Yeah, in fact, you could argue the big banks are the ones who built the plumbing for this whole shadow market. They're pumping money in at every level. Think about it. They lend money to the people who invest in the private funds. Then they lend money directly to the funds. And sometimes they even lend money to the very same companies that the private funds are lending to. It's a whole interconnected system.
And this right here, this is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. This is just a partial list of the credit lines from big, familiar banks to just one single fund from a giant like Blackstone. You see Bank of America, Citi, Wells Fargo, they're all in there, pouring billions of dollars into these special entities the fund creates. It just goes to show you, this private credit machine, it needs the big bank's money to run.
And just when you think it's complicated enough, it gets another layer deeper. Let's talk about something called NAV loans. Regulators have a great nickname for these. They call them leverage on leverage. And that's exactly what it is. A fund takes out a loan, and the collateral for that loan is its investments in other companies that are already loaded up with debt. So you're literally just stacking debt on top of more debt. It's a lot.
So all this cheap money and all these connections, it fueled an absolute gold rush, a massive boom. But like with any boom, you have to wonder when the bust is coming. And by late 2025, we started to see the first cracks appearing in the foundation.
What really kicked things into high gear was when this whole market opened up to everyday people. It wasn't just for the big pension funds anymore. You had new platforms popping up, letting you and me get in on the action for as little as, say, 10 grand. Suddenly, Main Street was getting in on Wall Street's new favorite game.
But then things started to get a little shaky. The warning signs started flashing. You had some big-name companies that were funded this way suddenly go bankrupt. You saw major players in the private credit world, like Blue Owl, watch their stock prices tank. Heck, even a giant like BlackRock had to admit one of its loans was basically worthless, marking it down to zero. But here's the kicker for me. More than 10% of the companies borrowing this money couldn't even make their interest payments in cash anymore.
And that brings us to a really important, kind of sneaky point. If you look at the official number of companies defaulting, it looks tiny, super low, like 1.3%. But that's not the whole story. There's this other category called selective defaults. This is where a company can't pay its interest in cash, so they just roll it into the loan, making the debt bigger. And that rate? It's more than 3 times higher. It's a way the real stress in the system can stay hidden right under our noses.
So with all these hidden problems bubbling up, it's no surprise that regulators are finally starting to sit up and pay very close attention. But what's happening now is, well, it's kind of weird. It's almost contradictory. On one side, you have the Bank of England kicking off the first ever stress test of this market, and you have U.S. senators screaming for the same thing over here. But on the other side, at the exact same time, U.S. regulators are actually making some of the post-2008 banking rules weaker. The very rules that, pushed all this lending into the shadows to begin with. It's a strange mixed message.
All of this brings us to the big debate, the central conflict as we look ahead to 2026. Is all this worry just a bunch of hype, hysteria, as the people inside the industry would say, or is it a genuine warning sign, a harbinger of a real crisis on the way? And you can really split this into two camps. In one corner, you've got the industry heavyweights, people like the CEO of Apollo, who are saying, relax, this is all based on myths. Our system is actually safer. But in the other corner, you have organizations like the IMF pointing to some scary data, things like 15% of borrowers not making enough to even pay their interest. And they're predicting a reckoning is coming, maybe as soon as 2026.
For a lot of economists who are watching all this risk get shuffled around, passed from bank to fund and back again, all hidden in these complex deals, it just feels eerily familiar. There's this real sense of déjà vu. Like one of them said, we've seen this movie before.
So that really leaves us with the big question as we head into 2026. We're supposed to have learned the lessons from 2008, right? But the game has changed. Back then, you could argue the risk was hiding in plain sight. Now we have to ask ourselves, is it still there, just hiding in a much deeper shadow?